Really loud, isn't it? I'll try not to shout too much. My name is David Howell. Many of you know me. Some of you here or virtually may not. My pronouns are he and his. So, welcome to West Side, and everyone managed to figure out what time it was. Some clocks do this by themselves. My car clock is going to be off an hour for the next 4 months, because when I looked at the directions on how to do that, it was so utterly bewildering. I just said, I can add or subtract an hour for 4 months. That's okay. I don't need to figure it out. Welcome to West Side. We are a welcoming community and here for everyone to join us. There are a list of announcements on the second page of your service here. I just wanted to say something about next weekend, which is fall retreat at Pickens State Park, starting Friday through Sunday, Friday afternoon through Sunday morning. Sign-up sheets are in the sanctuary or register online. Registration link is in our newsletter. Price is $40 per person to cover food and rental fees. But if for anyone, as I'm sure you all know, somehow that's a deterrent to coming, just please come. This is a good time together. Due to our annual church retreat at Pickett Park, the 11:13 service will be pre-recorded and broadcast at the usual service time on YouTube. For those interested in attending in-person worship, we will be playing the live stream on a television in our sanctuary. So I talked with Brad, who is in charge and does all these things marvelously, and he said, that's it. If anybody wants to come, you can sit here and watch a TV. On the other hand, you can sit and watch on your receiver, whatever it may be like at home, and there's no point in coming here. Our regular service, of course, will be at Pickett, where a good number of us will be. I don't think there are any other announcements that I have, but I know Lori has something to say.
Hi, I want to give you some updates about our legacy campaign to pay down the mortgage. It's going quite well. The beginning, or the basic numbers were in the newsletter on Wednesday, but I'm going to read you some anyway. So take out your phone and switch to the numbers thing from the alphabet thing so that the numbers part makes sense. Our mortgage balance started at a little over $82,000. It is now $46,900, which is, whoa, 3 months. That's really good. Our October contributions alone were $13,700, and our total contributions are $33,000 and a little over $500. Sorry, I have to catch my breath. It keeps running away. The payoff date, instead of 2033, is now June 2nd of 2028. 5.5 years. So we've taken an 11-year mortgage and cut it in half. 5.5 years. That's pretty good. And Jonas gave us a new phrase, which is the bank's matching, which is to say interest saved, is $18,050. We won't have to pay at all on that mortgage because we've paid early. Also, we pay, the church pays $818.12 every month. When we started the pay down, or the first time I've got a record of, which was September 2nd of this fall, we were paying, of that $818, we were paying $459 toward the principal, and we were paying $359 of interest. Because we've prepaid so much of this now, every time we make a mortgage payment, $612 of that is now principal instead of $459. And $205 of it's interest instead of $358. So we're paying a lot more efficiently because we've taken care of so much of the interest. I've put the poster, or Bob's put the poster up here, and you may or may not be able to see it where you're sitting, but it's going to stay here. And it gives in pencil, which I'm sure you can't see, what would happen to all these nice numbers if we get $5,000 a month for the next 3 months of this campaign. But it also gives you details on how we've progressed, and that gives you the numbers that I just announced. So good job, yay team. Thanks.
I don't think there are any more announcements. Does anybody else have anything to say? Well, in that case, you're up.
Sandra's going to be. Go ahead, Sandra.
For our gathering music this morning, I'm going to play what is labeled in my music book a Negro spiritual, which was the correct term at the time that book was published. And I've got Peace Like a River, and I just wanted to tell you the story of it. As you know, most of the spirituals have their roots in Bible stories. And this one's inspired by Isaiah 66. For this is what the Lord says, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the wealth of nations like a flooding stream. And this does appear in our hymnal if you wanted to see the beautiful words. But hopefully you'll enjoy the beautiful music.
Thank you, Sandra. Morning, everyone. Good to see you all, especially good morning to those of you who are participating and attending virtually this morning. We're happy to have you all here. My name is Reverend Carol Bedeau. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am privileged to serve here as minister. This morning, our topic is one that can be a little prickly. So before we even start, I'm going to invite y'all to take a big, deep breath. It's a topic that's important to us as a denomination and that is culturally big stuff right now. So I'm going to invite the bowl to sound. And what I'm going to invite us to do is enter into a spirit of curiosity, to open our minds and open our hearts as we talk about what it means to be a tradition that is rich with the resources of many other traditions. So as the bowl sounds, I invite you to simply come present into this moment and also open your mind and your heart to being curious.
Carol will light the chalice. Usually I look for a poem to read, but I was reading a book of essays by Lauren Isley, poet and botanist, an all-round modern humanist. He would have been, I think, very much at home in a Unitarian church, though I don't know if he ever was in one. Anyway, I found a section from an essay called The Hidden Teacher. Over 2,000 years ago, a man named Job, crouching in the desert, was moved to challenge what he felt to be the injustice of his God. The voice in the whirlwind in return volleyed pitiless questions upon the supplicant. A youth standing by, one Elihu, also played a role in this drama, for he ventured diffidently to his protesting elder that it was not true that God failed to manifest himself. He may speak in one way or another, though men do not perceive it. In consequence of this remark, perhaps it would be well, whatever our individual beliefs, to consider what may be called the hidden teacher. We think we learn from teachers, and we sometimes do, but the teachers are not always to be found in school or in laboratories. Sometimes what we learn depends upon our own powers of insight. Moreover, our teachers may be hidden, even the greatest teacher. And it was the young man Elihu who observed that if the old are not always wise, neither can the teacher's way be ordered by the young, whom he would teach. As I was reading this, it struck me that there is a subtext going on, which I am very much in sympathy with, which is that education, when it's done properly, is always a conversation. And since Carol and I have the opportunity to have a conversation for what I hope is our mutual enjoyment here in a bit, we can demonstrate that sort of thing going on and talk about how it is that we learn and don't learn. The other subtext that struck me was the way in which religions over the centuries are constantly conversing with each other, almost always badly. And that's why this, whatever one's views on cultural appropriation may be, this is a topic that really needs to be talked about more. Even newer versions of an old religion, as they change, talk with each other badly, each one convinced that they have to be the one who's finally got it right. Well, I don't think Carol and I will ever think that we got it right, but perhaps the conversation can progress things a bit.
So the concept today is conversation and relationship around this topic of cultural appropriation. So today we're going to be talking about this concept, cultural appropriation, sometimes called cultural misappropriation. It's really relevant right now, and it's particularly relevant in Unitarian Universalism. So before I talk about that for a minute, I want to tell you about something that's happening in our denomination that we all need to know about. So how many of you know what the 7 principles are? I mean, they're everywhere, right? That's how we say, when we say, what do you use, believe, we say these 7 principles, right? Well, the 7 principles and the 6 sources, which are also, go right along with the 7 principles, the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, those are located in something called Article 2 of the bylaws of Unitarian Universalism. It is also in our bylaws as a denomination that every few years, Article 2 is reviewed and studied. So there has been, the last year or so, a review of Article 2 happening by an organization called the Article 2 Study Commission. They've been doing some pretty sweeping assessment of Article 2. And it includes sort of the principles, purposes, and specifically the 7 principles and the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism. They've done a lot of research, they've done a lot of study groups, they've talked to a lot of people, they've talked to a lot of stakeholders. They are proposing sweeping changes to Article 2. They just released this about 2 weeks ago. So the way this process works is the proposed new Article 2 is on the website of the UUA's Article 2 Study Commission. They have essentially they've eliminated the 6 sources, and they've completely revised the 7 principles. They're no longer listed in the same way they were. They specifically are designed to address racial justice and equity and cultural appropriation. So, and what will be happening for the next few months is they will be receiving feedback on this draft, and in June at our General Assembly, the first vote on the proposed bylaw changes will happen. So what I'm suggesting that you all do is let's get educated about that. I think, I don't know if they're available right now, but I have created a side-by-side comparison of the old Article 2 and the new Article 2. So you can see what the changes are. But they've changed, it no longer says, these are the 7 principles, ... There's a completely new formulation of them, and they include accountability, and they include asking us to take specific action. Brad is showing us in the back of the room here that there are handouts available you can pick up at the end of the service today that outlines these differences. So in fact, our whole denomination is talking about changing its basic statements to address accountability, particularly on issues of cultural appropriation and racial equity and justice issues, and to make us more accountable on those subjects. This is why it's relevant, particularly now. So, today we're going to have one piece of that conversation about cultural appropriation and how it's different from cultural appreciation and how we kind of think about holding ourselves accountable on this subject. And I'm going to give you an example, calling myself in, not calling myself out, but calling myself in on a sort of borderline cultural appropriation thing that I've been doing that I want to address. So there are lots of tools and practices and concepts that we as UUs borrow from other cultures. And frequently we will use little bits and pieces of other cultures without them being in their context, separate from their context, separate from an understanding of the deeper theological or cultural meanings associated with those tools or practices. And one of the things we do that with is inviting our bowl to sound. So when we do this without really recognizing or honoring the context of the borrowed tool, we risk using them in ways that can be seen as appropriation, which means taking, causing harm by minimizing or trivializing others' cultures, taking the pieces we like to use that aren't necessarily fully respectful of that culture. So, a couple definitions. An article on this subject recently by Beth Dreyer and Liz Schumer, which was published, interestingly enough, in Good Housekeeping, which tells you how broad in our culture this is. This isn't just in the halls of academia. Good Housekeeping is publishing articles about this topic, which means it's at all levels of our social concern. Okay, here's what they say. Cultural appropriation, also called cultural misappropriation, occurs when a person from one culture adopts the fashion, iconography, trends, or styles from a culture that's not their own. Some of the most harmful examples of cultural appropriation occur when the culture being appropriated is one of a historically oppressed group. And they offer a few key questions we can ask ourselves to help understand if what we're doing is cultural appropriation. And we're going to ask these questions about the use of the singing bowl. So the first question is what I'm doing furthering a stereotype? The second question, am I using something sacred to another culture in a flippant or fun way outside of its intended use? And third, am I engaging with a piece of ancient culture as if it's new? Am I neglecting to credit the source of my inspiration? So, applied to our bowl. When we open our services using the bowl, are we furthering a stereotype? I'm going to say, in that particular situation, no. We're not being stereotypical in any way. Somebody else might argue with me about that. Are we using it in a flippant way just for fun? Again, no. It's the third question where we, or specifically I, can do better. Am I using something ancient as if it's new or neglecting to credit the source of my inspiration? And perhaps the answer to that question is yes. Recently, I learned that though we have a tendency to call these bowls Tibetan, that's not accurate. They are more accurately described as Himalayan bowls, which gives a more accurate geographic description of their origin. And though I have personally studied actually the sacred context of bowls and the history of the bowls and their theological meanings, so I have some small understanding of that much deeper and richer history and meaning, I haven't really actually shared much of that here. And that sort of tips me over into cultural appropriation. If, when we invite the bowl to sing, and I want you to notice that I'm very specific in saying we invite the bowl to sing or to sound. I do not say, and we used to say this, but I very much consciously steered us away from it. We do not say that we are playing the bowl, because it's not a musical instrument. If, when we invite it to sound, we lack understanding of a few core concepts about the sacred tool, then we are using it in a way that lacks respect for the centuries of spiritual practice and cultural meaning with which this tool is imbued. And so here are a few things we need to understand about our bowl. Some basic history. The use of metal singing bowls originated at least 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. It made its way to the Himalayan region, Tibet, Nepal, India. The bowls eventually became a central spiritual tool in Buddhism, but they are also closely tied to other traditions. They are still produced by traditional craftspeople in those areas, with deep ties to the culture and spirituality of the artisans making them. So that's really important. The fair trade nonprofit organization 10,000 Villages speaks about the cultural use of the bowls by saying this. The artisans producing singing bowls in partnership with 10,000 Villages have learned the skill of singing bowl craftsmanship from relatives and from apprenticeships, and they share the process of singing bowl casting with us. Our artisan partners in Nepal heat the metal to red-hot malleability. Then they either sandcast or hammer, mold, and polish the bowl before it may be etched in designs. It takes great skill patience, and collaboration between multiple artisans with different skills to complete a single singing bowl. Unfortunately, and this is 10,000 Villages saying this about the bowls, singing bowls have found their way into mass production in many places in the West. And there's been some debate about the appropriation of Eastern culture in so doing. Should Westerners without any Tibetan, Nepali, or East Indian heritage profit from the sale of these cultural pieces? It is problematic for Western people to pick and choose the elements of Eastern culture that may appeal to them, while often continuing to act from a place of prejudice and internalized racism towards those same cultures. There's no doubt that the benefits of the singing bowl and the rich culture inherent in them should be shared far and wide. However, that culture should be experienced with reverence and appreciation, not appropriation. We are grateful to the Nepali artisans we partner with for choosing to share their rich culture with us. Our artisan partners are always paid fair wages for their work with upfront financing. So, there's some things that are important in that message. Our bowl. I have absolutely no idea how or where our bowl was made. Not a clue. The bowl that I have at home in my own spiritual practice, I know exactly where it was made, and I know exactly who brought it from the Himalayas to this country. But I don't know that about this bowl. I have no idea if money for the purchase of this bowl went to a Western manufacturer or to a traditional artisan in support of their culture and their community and their livelihood. I don't know. 10,000 Villages tells us that though the bowls were originally made of pure copper for medicinal purposes, they are now made of either bronze, or this is important, a combination of 7 metals: copper, tin, zinc, iron, lead, gold, and silver, to represent the 7 chakras. I have no idea what metals this bowl is made of. But this is what I do know about the tradition of that culture, the culture from which these bowls come. The metal they're made of matters, because every metal in that system has a spiritual, physical, and medicinal correlate. So a bowl that's made out of tin or lead or zinc or a different alloy, the different alloys are supposed to do different stuff to our bodies when we play them and change our spiritual systems. So respecting the meaning of the bowl would require that I at least attempt to know that, right? That would be like a physician using a drug, not knowing what it does in the spiritual systems we're talking about. Now, another thing, you may or may not have noticed that each time I invite the bowl to sound, when I hold it, I blow breath into it before I invite it to sound. That's not random. This is to honor the life of the bowl, which has a spirit of its own, and to recognize that I am merging my life force with the spirit of the bowl each time I interact with it. This is not a ritual I learned from anyone else. It's my personal way of honoring the spirit of the bowl. Okay? It's understanding that in the tradition of the people who create these bowls, they are spiritual beings, not musical instruments. So in a moment, we're going to talk about how to appreciate and honor the traditions from which we borrow, but it's really important to remember that every time we use a tool or a ritual or a piece of music, whatever it is, we are inviting into our space the depth and the breadth of that culture's practices and theology and beliefs. So it doesn't actually matter whether we believe that there's a spirit in the bowl or not. We don't get to say, I don't believe that, so it's not relevant. If we are going to be respectful and in conversation and in relationship with the cultures we borrow from, we need to know that they believe that. Because imagine if you saw someone using a chalice for meatloaf. You might have a feeling about it. You might have a feeling about it. You might say, wait a minute, that's an important image. You don't use that as a serving bowl at a potluck. This is important. I see that by David standing there, he has a question or a comment. David?
Yeah, one of the things you said I hadn't heard before, that bowls had a long history before they ever got to the Himalayas.
Absolutely.
So this process, which you're calling appropriation, but which is always a two-sided thing, had been going on for a long time, and it had been constantly changing. My way of looking at this issue is the extent to which both sides lose when only power and immediate kind of really debased, like pecuniary advantage, is what gets involved in what's going on. That the bowl has a particular spirit. I think, what if we look at it as if this spirit is constantly, in a fluid sort of way, capable of being changed? We need to listen better, but those who are in temporary possession of something which has a much longer range of life have the need to listen as well. Anybody who teaches knows you don't learn anything just by sitting passively. The only way you learn is by some kind of active participation. And this is such a beautiful opportunity for mutual active participation in which there is so much motivation of, you're just taking advantage of me, so I'm not going to listen to you. You're just now out of step and out of time, and we're in charge, so we don't need to listen to you. What a disastrous kind of thing to do. So do you have suggestions?
So-
one more thing I wanted to say,
Yes.
sorry. You really are at a place to do something about this. One of the things I really like about being a member of this congregation is how fluidly we all, not always, how fluidly we look at our rituals and our practices and our beliefs. All of them are supposed to be considered and reconsidered. And this is a perfect opportunity to talk about that basic kind of policy we have.
So in a few minutes, first we're going to let David introduce the offering, and Sandra's going to play some music for that. And then after that, we're going to talk about some of the differences between appropriation and what we might call acculturation, or syncretism, which is the blending of cultures that is inevitable when cultures meet, and how to tell the difference, and how to help us be people that are doing this kind of acculturation or syncretism mindfully and with respect and in relationship.
Yes.
Excellent.
Sandra? So it's time for our offering for the sustenance of the church and the community. Our share of the plate partner for this quarter is C, which stands for Serving Immigrants, a local profit founded in 2022 that connects families who are seeking asylum with mental health clinicians and immigration lawyers. So give as one is able to do so.
Thank you, Sandra. All right, so David has asked the question that is literally listed next in my little set of notes here about the question that's most often asked, all right? When we have this definition of cultural appropriation, when one person or a group of persons from a culture adopts fashions, iconography, rituals, practices, trends, or styles from a culture not their own, most often it's appropriation. Often that involves members of a dominant culture, often a colonizing or conquesting culture, adopting the modes of oppressed or underrepresented people, okay? And the most common question that comes up right away is, how is that different from acculturation, which is people blend together, or syncretism. And syncretism is a word we don't often think about very much or don't know. Syncretism is a word that's used to describe religious blending, when religions meet. So, for example, the way that Christianity is imbued with Judaism and Islam is imbued with traits of both of those. Syncretism is the way that religions specifically, but it can be used to describe broader cultural trends, the way that they blend or merge or bleed into each other. So how is that different? Okay, in other words, don't cultures always borrow and share and exchange things? Okay, so back to Beth Draher and Liz Schumer, who I thought articulated this brilliantly in Good Housekeeping. I mean, I've read lots of, all kinds of intellectual and academic things on this subject, but they put it really well. The line between what differentiates cultural appropriation, and they say from cultural appreciation, can be razor thin, not to mention highly controversial. Some say appropriation doesn't exist because no culture is completely original and uninfluenced by any other. Others believe that creatives like designers and musical artists get a pass on this because their art is open to discussion and interpretation. The key to practicing appreciation rather than appropriation, they say, is to understand the culture you're borrowing from, including acknowledging its history of oppression and or marginalization. It helps to support creators from that culture too, whenever possible. So, they acknowledge that defining something as cultural appropriation versus syncretism or appreciation, that these definitions are in fact subjective to some degree, right? The edges are not super clear, right? What one person from Tibetan culture might say about our use of the bowl is not necessarily the same thing that someone else would say from Tibet or Nepal or India, right? They can be wildly different. I've personally experienced that extensively in working with Native North American indigenous people. What they say about non-Native people playing frame drums, what they say about non-Native people playing North American flutes can range wildly from one individual to another. So there is a high level of subjectivity in this, but that doesn't excuse us from being conscious about it. There are always ways that we can help ourselves steer away from appropriation and towards appreciation. So, all right, David, questions, thoughts, comments?
Rather than a question so much, it's simply, I think it's helpful to look at how the more powerful side loses in the process. Some application of Gresham's law, if I've got this right, bad money drives out good money. The worst way of doing things tends to win out over better ways of doing it. Doing it in a better way takes more time, takes more patience, takes more, well, appreciation is a good word here, but it is, look at all that we have to learn from you. Obviously, you've been at this for a long time. You know something of what you're doing, but when things are static, that's part of my sense of you use. If things are static, things are going bad. We need to be changing them all the time, or at least thinking about changing them all the time. And one way of changing things is to look to see where rituals, ideas, stories of other older religious traditions can offer us some new way of doing things. I'm going to say this with some care. Slavery is a bad thing, right? But slave owners really end up badly in this as well as the slaves. Power corrupts. And whenever you turn it into a matter of power, it's going to be something that everyone is going to lose from. So can you think of some examples in which some long-standing use of a tool or a ritual or a story has really moved from one religion to another or one generation of religion to another in a way that's been respectful, appreciative of those who were already there, and enriches those who are taking it to try and use it for themselves? It'd be nice if we had one example at least of some time in which this happened well.
So that's a tricky question. I'm curious to see if anybody might have an example of that. The examples I'm thinking of they're about individuals. This is where it's not about, it's subjective, it's about an individual. That's a matter of assessing an individual's motivation. So let's take the example of me and the bowl. At home, my bowl and I have a very different relationship than my relationship with the bowl here. My bowl use at home is very, it's not appropriation, it's very appreciative and respectful. My relationship here with the bowl has been completely different. Completely different.
Can you say how it's completely?
Sure. So in my situation with my bowl that I have at home, I went to a man from Nepal who was Nepali and practiced traditional religion. He brought bowls out of that area to protect them from the Chinese incursions into that region. And he loved and respected and had very deep theology about the bowls. When my bowl came home with me, I went to where he had them, but I didn't just say, that's cool, I think I'll buy it. I spent 3 or 4 hours sitting in a corner on the floor praying with all the bowls that were around me, praying deeply and holding them and asking them which one, if any of them, felt that their spirit would want to be with my spirit. And ultimately, I had a very profound spiritual experience sitting there, a very profound spiritual experience. And that bowl is an honored spiritual presence in my home. I speak of her only with reverence. I don't play her like a musical instrument. She is a version of God that lives in my house, and she has a personality and a spirit. She and I have a relationship. We are in relationship. So it's an individual thing. I have been in situations, this is another good example for us, we frequently like to use Native North American musical instruments, drums, flutes, and things like that. Native elders, I have worked with Native elders who have said the North American flute is meant to be played by all if you are playing it with a good heart. It's about the good heart. So the difference is not necessarily something that we can necessarily see from the outside. If I'm playing a North American flute to show off that by gosh, I got this, it's a power dynamic, right? It's a power dynamic. But if I'm playing it of a good heart and I'm in a place of love, that's different. Native people watching me play flutes and drums have had different responses based on their own individual concerns and perspectives. So really it's about conversation and relationality in ways that are subtle. So let me talk for a minute about economy, about money with this too. So we've both mentioned a little bit about power and money. There's an important word when we talk about cultural tools, and that is exchange. Distinguishing between appropriation, which basically means taking, and acculturation or syncretism has to do with how the exchange happens. So let's take the example of 10,000 villages. They are in relationship with cultural artisans who choose to share the work. They are treated with respect. It is a fair trade relationship. That is a very different exchange than Western people in wherever who are like, bowls are selling, let's make some and make some money on it. That's a very different cultural exchange. So the key in that is really about socioeconomic power. So we have to ask, what is the power dynamic inherent in the use of the tradition or the object or the symbol? Does it come from a culture that I or we have inherent power in some way, even as part of larger dominant culture, that we have power over? Is there any dynamic of oppression or cultural dominance that we need to pay attention to here? Doesn't mean we're not going to use the bowl just because there is, but it means we need to ask the question. And number two, we have to ask if we're treating the culture that we borrowed the thing from as if they are cultural equals. And this is really important in UU context, because, and the bowl is a great example of this. We have to ask, what assumptions do we make about either the inferiority or the superiority of the culture we're borrowing from or sharing with, okay? So let's take in Unitarian Universalism, we have both. Some UUs have the cultural assumption that the mysticism inherent in what I just described about bowl use is intellectually inferior or culturally inferior, that it is behind us. Other UUs make the opposite assumption, that it's culturally superior, that it's better than us. Neither of those is a relationship of equals. Both of those are problematic. We might think we're better than, or we might romanticize the cultures that we're borrowing from, okay? So we have to ask ourselves, what's our relationship with this culture? We have to ask ourselves not whether we care about the culture, but do we take care, right? In a lived and embodied way. So we have to ask ourselves, are we acting in material ways that make the exchange a fair trade exchange? To care about another culture as an intellectual concept, frankly, for oppressed peoples, feels like appropriation. Like, we're sorry, let's take it anyway. And I say that simply as having talked to lots and lots of people who feel that their tools and rituals are being appropriated. That to say, well, we think you're cool isn't enough. I want to give an example of this. So, years ago when I was serving a church in California with the drum, I played the drum. The community really loved their native North American rituals and traditions. I said, okay, we need to educate ourselves about the concerns of the local tribe. We need to, if we're going to use their cultures and traditions, we need to know what's happening to the culture. We need to be in a relationship, in a conversation, in an exchange. And there were proposals on the ballot about gaming initiatives, casino initiatives in the area. And there was a disconnect in the community between how they felt about the gaming initiatives and the rights and the needs and the cultural concerns of the tribe with using the tools of the tribe. That's where we have to be careful. That's where it's about these economies of exchange. David?
Yeah, one of the things, Carol and I spent a couple hours talking about things. One of the things I pretty quickly realized, we want to talk about different things. Not simply come up with different answers, but deal with different topics. But one of them there, the individual versus the collective. If it's just you yourself with your bowl at home that you have gotten and you use for your own private relational rituals, you can kind of work out how you're going to do it. But whenever it is a congregational, a collective kind of decision of how we're going to do it, then all kinds of problems arise.
Yes.
But I really am the eternal optimist. It isn't just problems that arise, opportunities arise too. We listen to other people's ideas and try to be quiet enough so that people who often don't speak up actually say something about what's going on, and here's their idea of how we might use this. I just love the idea of the bowl. I mean, what a beautiful, something with hundreds of years of Buddhist tradition, and I didn't even know that it went back to other traditions before that, each one fluidly moving from one to another, and now we're picking it up, and how we can use this not just as individuals in which we can agree to disagree, but in a collective kind of way, so that when we all listen to it sound together in this conversational way, even though no words may be spoken, how we can do it well. The other thing that struck me when I said, so can you give an example of when things go well? And you kind of did, going, but it's easy to talk about how things go badly. I mean, that's just so easy. Cheap, grabbing immediate, get some kind of praise or money or status or whatever for the moment, and the future will just somehow take care of itself. Once again, can you give a good example, particularly on a congregational, some kind of collective
Yeah.
basis in which this happens well?
The best example I can come up with is the ways that contemporary musicians acknowledge consistently the African roots of a lot of contemporary music. There's a pretty but it took courageous individuals naming it first to bring that into the collective consciousness that rock music, blues, jazz, like that a lot of these movements are rooted in African music. So I think that's an example where individuals naming it led to an increased collective understanding, which, if I can continue on the next step, because you're doing a great job leading to the next question, why do we care about this as Unitarian Universalists? The deal is this: as Unitarian Universalists, we have a little bit more responsibility maybe than the average person on the street. There's a reason for that. As UUs, we have an explicit and stated commitment to the values of justice, equity, and compassion. Like, we literally, as UUs, state that this is part of our values. And so, if we are going to live those values out, we do have some responsibility to have these kinds of conversations, to ask the difficult questions about power dynamics, about cultural sharing. We have to ask, are we acting in a fair trade kind of way? And we have to be willing to be uncomfortable with those questions, because they're uncomfortable. It's not about dogma. It's about a conversation. It's about being willing to be in conversation. We as UUs explicitly state that we have a commitment to being in relationship with other communities. And so because of that, because we say our first principle, as it's currently stated, is to honor the inherent worth and dignity of all other persons, that means that when someone says, ouch, we gotta listen to them. And people are saying, ouch. UUs of color and UUs from other cultures are saying, ouch, and they're saying it loudly. And people in the broader culture are saying that. So as UUs, there's a reason that this is something we as a collective are addressing. Even if it makes us uncomfortable, or even if as individuals we may be in a different place on this topic, collectively, as a corporate body, it is in our corporate values to ask these questions.
I was struck by your using musicians as an example. One of my general beliefs are artists and scientists, the artistic community, the scientific community, are really pretty good at listening to the past, keeping it, rejecting it, changing it, adapting it. Religious institutions are pretty close to the worst at doing that. Exactly the place in which the most fluidity and the best listening ought to be happening is where it happens worst, because so many competing kinds of cheap values come in. So I'll ask the same question a third time. Can you give a religious, we've got thousands of years of religions continually moving from one to another, appropriating, using, adapting previous ones. Can you give an example where this really happened well?
No. No. And I'll tell you why my answer for that is. It's possible that it exists, but most of the history of religion is also the history of conquest.
Yeah.
Right? Most of the history of religion is the history of conquest of one culture over another. And that's how religions transmute and transform. And so inherent in that is power dynamics that are problematic. And I don't know enough of the subtle, small culture histories to say, well, there was these 3 tribes in this one place where it went great. But for the most part, what we know of history is a culture with more weapons or more people or dominant power took over the spaces and places of another culture, dominating them, and then those religions adapted and adopted. So unfortunately,
Didn't mean to depress you all.
didn't mean to depress you, but so this is really important. It actually means that even if we're not currently colonial, we do not see ourselves currently as colonializing anybody, and there's arguments about that. When someone from a culture that has historically been oppressed says, this still stings, this still hurts. When black UUs say, ee, that's uncomfortable. When Buddhist UUs say, ee, that was uncomfortable. We have a responsibility, a corporate responsibility, because we have corporate agreement to listen to that. It means for us, here's what it really means for us. It means prioritizing our relationships and our conversations, even challenging ones, over our personal comfort and preferences. That's basically what it means. And I would say that one of the most wonderful things about this is David and I came into this conversation a week or so ago. We sat down in my office, and his questions, I've spent years being trained about cultural appropriation, and I will absolutely admit that I've had lots of conditioning and dogma about it, without a doubt, because there's dogma about this too. It is normal and natural for us to push back against that. But the spirit of conversation, David's questions, sitting with him in my office, I said to him afterwards, I said, David, you help my ministry so much because you ask such good questions that help me articulate what really matters in the message. And so that's really the spirit of this, folks. It's getting past our resistance or our assumptions, either for or against. There are people who are very reactive. That's cultural appropriation. You should never do that. You're bad. I have absolutely encountered that in my life. I have been threatened. I have had people attack me. All kinds of things have happened. I've met lots of dogma in that direction, and I've met lots of dogma in the other direction. It's all fine. It's all cultural sharing. What really matters for us as UUs is being willing to open our minds and open our hearts and be willing to be in relationship, have conversations, and ask questions with a willingness to hear.
And also the context helps. Perfect time, next weekend, we're going to be out in the woods. We're going to be going through days which move from eating together to playing games together to walking together to having services together. That's the kind of context which makes it easier to ask questions and think about possibilities and what do you think about this, that kind of process going on. So
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to next weekend.
Absolutely.
And I hope you are too.
Yeah. So just a closing thought. Unitarian Universalism, like all traditions, is a living thing. It grows and it changes, and we grow and change with it. The tradition is always in a process of growth and transformation. In an increasingly global society, we have the privilege of access to incredible resources, wisdom, knowledge, tools that come from all over the world throughout all of time. It is an honor that we can accept gracefully to engage with them in ways that really honor the inherent worth of their creators, of the people who practice those traditions as their core traditions, and do so in ways that promote justice and equity and compassion. I'm going to ask David to extinguish our chalice as we close our time together. But know that we take in our hearts a commitment to welcoming the light of new understanding, the warmth of real caring, lived, embodied, active caring for others in our world, and the fire of commitment to living our values more fully each day. So there will be lots of conversations about this, one-on-one, in the denomination. I encourage you to take a look at the UUA's website. It's the Article 2 Study Commission. Pick up a copy, or I think Brad's also got those online, the side-by-side comparison, because as a denomination, we are moving towards a much more engaged conversation about these issues. So let's be part of it. Let's be part of the conversation in a spirit that matches our values. May it be so. Go in peace and passion.
Thank you. I hope you had half as much fun as I did.